Good morning to everybody, and thank you so much for joining us here today for this panel on the business of being a director. My name is Kris Manos, and I'll be moderating the discussion today. I've been a corporate director for over a dozen years and served on all kinds of boards, from public to private to employee-owned and private equity-backed, as well as nonprofits. So I'll provide some color commentary throughout the panel. I also serve, as do I think all of our panelists today, on at least one part of the board of the Tri-Cities chapter for NACD. So I'm delighted that we have such a great set of topic experts here from our own board structure. Let me do a little bit of the housekeeping first. We are recording the moderated part of the discussion today, and so the speakers are spotlighted, which means we don't really get to see all of you, although we know you are there, and we encourage you to submit your questions into the chat. We'll take about 45 minutes for the moderated discussion and 15 minutes for open Q&A. We'll get to as many questions as we can. At the end of that, for the last 15 minutes, we'll have a couple of breakout rooms set up. So if we haven't gotten to your question or you want to dig deeper into a particular topic, feel free to stay on for those breakout rooms and that deeper discussion. And also, I want to be sure and welcome anyone who's joining us for the first time. We always love new attendees, and we look forward to getting to know you. So first, let me touch on the panelists who have joined me today. You've gotten their bios both by email ahead of time, and I think they're all in the chat. But as I go around the way we're on my screen, we have David Bixby, a partner at Meridian Compensation Partners, joining us. Travis Wofford, who is from Baker Botts and is both the vice chair of their global M&A practice and the chair of the Houston corporate department. And also Steve Newton, who's a managing director at Russell Reynolds and a practice leader for global education for them. So I couldn't ask for a more esteemed group of co-panelists here and topic experts. We're going to try to think about this really as the business of being a director, right? So what does it mean to you to choose a career as a director? So we'll touch on why would you want to do this? What does it really entail to be a director in terms of the duties, the time commitment, the risks? We'll touch on what kinds of compensation you can expect from being a director. And then finally, some thoughts on how to get a board seat, right? I'm sure it's top of mind for many people on this call of how do you actually get that first seat and the ones beyond? And do we have some both pragmatic suggestions and tips? So with that, you all had the opportunity to submit thoughts into a word cloud in the pre-meeting room. So Maya, could you share the results of that word cloud to give us a flavor for why the people on this call think about being a director? And as we're reflecting on that, I think the choice to be a director, right? Your most limited resource is your time. So choosing to spend it this way means you care about something in this word cloud. And Steve, can you share your perspective?
Look, it's quite obvious that everyone would put governance as number one, and even mentoring number two, leadership number three. The one that I am most struck by, and we don't hear it enough, but I think is so important, is the one just below the word leadership, and that is learning. I think most good board members would tell the boards with whom they are interviewing that they want to take away as much as they want to put into the board. So the learning component is super important. Most CEOs will tell you that they learn as much from the boards on which they may serve outside their own company as they do from their own board. So I would really like to stress that as an important reason to join a board.
And Steve, do you have any thoughts on, are there wrong reasons for wanting to be a director?
Yes, and I'm gonna steal some thunder from David, which is compensation. The moment the moment that someone talks about compensation as being a motivator to join a board is the moment that they really need to do some self-reflection as to whether this is really the best opportunity for them.
Yeah. And I will note that I looked around the word cloud and couldn't find compensation on there anywhere. So you definitely want to be paid competitively for your time. But I was not surprised that we didn't see it in the cloud.
Yeah. And to me, being clear about this motivation, I think makes your candidacy for being a director much more compelling, right? If you can clearly articulate what you hope to bring to a board, and as Steve noted, what you hope to get out of it, that I think makes it, it's hard when candidates look like a deer in the headlights when they're asked why they want to do this. And sometimes you get answers like, it seemed like the logical next step for me, right? Which is probably not reflective enough to ensure you get to the next step in the interview process. I want to move on to talk about what really is the role of the director. And I remember when I was in a VP role at a company and presenting to the board, I thought that the board's main job was to ask me really hard questions. Challenge me, make me think more deeply, clarify my strategy, make sure, sometimes it was a test. Am I on my toes? Do I know my business? But the reality of board service is that it's so much more than that. And in fact, there's a lot of legal duties that are incumbent upon being a director. And Travis, if you'd like to start by lay out some of those duties that are critical.
Sure. Yeah, happy to do so. So we'll talk in the context of Delaware law, but most other states are very similar. The fundamental basis of all of this is that the responsibility for management of the company vests with the board of directors, and then you delegate that to your officers, right? And then in doing that delegation, you wind up with two main fiduciary duties. You get a duty of care and you get a duty of loyalty. What does that really mean? What it doesn't mean is not showing up to board meetings, not paying attention, not doing your homework, right? The duty of care does not mean you have to be perfect, but you do have to take the amount of care that an ordinarily prudent person would use in similar circumstances. So what does that mean? You show up to the meetings. You inform yourself of all material information reasonably available to you. You seek to understand what it says. You do your homework. You take enough time to actually understand it. You engage in discussion and deliberation on those issues. And then you know that you can rely on your officers, employees, other directors, like a committee, and reasonably selected outside experts to help you in that decision-making. Again, it's not perfection, but it's important to know that putting in the time, actually participating, is almost as important as the outcome itself. The second duty, just to hit it while we're on this, is the duty of loyalty. Used to be that was just, hey, make sure that what you're doing is in the best interest in the corporation and its stockholders. You need to be disinterested. Don't act for your personal interest over those of the corporation and the stockholders, and don't be beholden or non-independent of other people that do have personal differentiated interests. That's really expanded over the last maybe 30 years. You hear the word caremark, and that gets a lot of people's skin crawling about, an expansion of the responsibility of a director. You think in the 1980s, there's a lot of rubber stamping. Now there's this duty of oversight that we hear about in the news all the time. That's establishing oversight over all of the critical risks of the company, and then making sure that the board itself follows up. You can't just let the management team do that. The board has to do that. And so there are a lot of examples where this has come up, either an ice cream company in food safety, an airplane company in flight safety, or fast food restaurants and culture of sexual harassment, right? If you sit by and you haven't gotten into the weeds of what's going on from a reporting and then run those red flags to ground, you may find yourself, in a bad position from a liability perspective. And that's just fiduciary duties, right? If you're a public company, you've got layers and layers of other responsibilities, Sarbanes-Oxley, stock exchange, securities laws. There's the FTC, the FCC, the FERC, and the other alphabet soup of the government that is going to impose duties. You've got different stakeholders that are going to set expectations, whether that's investors and the street, or it's ESG, stakeholder, employee engagement. There are activists from any of those groups that'll come and tell you whether you're doing a good job, or more often that you're not. And just to hit the point, because I know it's a question that we get a lot, is that different in private companies? And the short answer is no. You don't have a difference in your fiduciary duties at a private company from a public company. There are some exceptions to that. An LLC, you can actually write in and say that the fiduciary duties are waived, but usually that's not going to happen for you. So if you think it has, make sure that the general counsel talks to you about that. I guess one thing just to hit on, because I don't want to scare anybody, is, okay, so let's say I'm actually showing up, I'm doing my job, I'm paying attention. Can I actually get protected from liability and lawsuit associated with it? Just to put this aside. Yes, that's what exculpation, which is a fancy word for exempting you from monetary liability, indemnification, D&O insurance, and all of these other things that you should be checking into before you accept a position would cover. Just make sure that you understand that doesn't protect you if you're interested in the transaction or you're not independent. And more importantly, it's only as good as, the piece of paper and the person that's promised to cover your legal expenses. But away from the legal point, let me just say there's real responsibility, right? You are going to have to find this as something where you put time and effort into. You've got to learn that company. You don't have to know as much about it as the CEO, but you have to put a diligent effort into learning the company. And that's why you've got the company, its advisors, and great places like NACD to help you in that.
So there's so much there to dig into more deeply. I'm going to start at the end, because I always find D&O insurance is a really interesting topic. Are there questions you would recommend people ask about the D&O policies of the boards that they're asked to serve on that you think are the most important questions to ask?
Sure. I always say get a copy of it and then ask what the gaps are. Right? D&O insurance policies have express exceptions in them. There are a lot of things that are excluded. Not every policy is the same, so it's worth checking and seeing what's covered and what's not. Until you've done that, you can't even begin to have the conversation. But a lot of people don't even do it. They just say, okay, D&O insurance, check, we're done.
Right. Reading the documents is always a really painful process when lawyers are very good at, but for most people, knowing the document exists is enough. But sometimes buried deeply in the documents is the thing that is going to trip you up or be a red flag. So I think when you talk about this risk and the potential risks of being a director, right, it falls into an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So I would love any of us to comment on if you were offered a board seat and we're looking at the company, what are the red flags that might tell you should think twice about whether to join this board? What things twig your spidey sense?
Well, let me just jump in, Kris, and I want to tackle with the D&O insurance first, and then I'm going to come back to the answer to the question. In all the years I've been doing search work, I have never found a board member to turn down a position once they were told there was D&O insurance. And so I'm coming back to what Travis is saying, which is so spot on. Read it. People say yes to joining a board once that box has been checked without any knowledge about what the exceptions are that Travis just referred to. To me, though, I'm going to come back to your bigger question, which is really this. you will be interviewing with the board, unless it's a company coming out of restructuring, you will be interviewing with the board on their very best day and on their best behavior. And what you really want to know is, what does that board look like on its very worst day? Travis referred to activists, but there are lots of other crises that can come across. And so to me, it's all about, is this a team that you trust and know will work collectively together for the best interests of the shareholders, the stakeholders, and the broader community? And if you don't have that trust, I don't care what the D&O insurance says, you should not be joining that board.
Yeah, you got to imagine you're with those 10 people stranded on a desert island for a few weeks with very few resources. And do you really want to be with them? Are they the folks you want in your boat?
And Kris, it sounds obvious to say this. The teamwork matters, but not enough candidates actually interview in and around the board when they're selecting. Coming back to this notion that we see lots of people who get to a point in their career where joining a board is sort of like joining the country club. It's what's expected of you versus really why are you joining it. But when you are joining it, while they're interviewing you, I can't emphasize enough the notion that you should be interviewing them in the same context. They're going to take references on you. You need to also take references on them. Maybe not in a very obvious way, but these are people who will be well known in the business community. Find out, do some soft referencing around, are these people that I can trust on the worst day of my board service, not on the best day?
I also think there's things that you can observe about a board that is data that over time, sometimes I wish I had taken more notice of. Board turnover, particularly if you're starting with looking at a nonprofit board that is going to lead and be a start of your board service. If that board's turning fast, in nonprofits, you're not paid. So often it's easier to cut and run than to stay and work to improve the business. So that to me is a flag. Obviously, litigation, accounting restatements are pretty obvious things, but I think also even board composition is an interesting signal about whether this is the group that you want to be a part of, and whether you think the board composition is healthy for the kind of business that you're joining. Sorry, I lost my train of questions here.
Kris, if I could add something, this is David Prang. In doing board searches, one of the things I've admired on some of the candidates that I've dealt with is their desire to have a one-on-one dinner or something with the CEO. Reason being, if the board's there and everything can be fine with the board, but if there's going to be a problem, it's going to start, internally on that. And you want to know, I think, who that CEO is, and is that someone you want to be on the island with?
Yes.
Yeah, and David, I think that's a great point. And let me just add to that, which is the dynamic of the CEO board process is super important. So, is the CEO as supportive of you joining the board as the board is? Because if you think that on most days the board wants to be supportive of the CEO, if you get the sense that you're not all on the same page, this is the time to find out. Because we've seen plenty of situations where boards will impose their candidates without the reverse, meaning, the CEO really thinks that this board member could be a good addition to the board, and the CEO could and would want to learn and work with the board member.
I guess kind of rounding this out, there's a difference between, and Steve and David, Kris, I'd like your thoughts on this. Getting that first board seat and getting, the second or fifth, or you're rolling off and you're looking for another. I think there's a level to which people can be choosy when they're a reputable long-term director. I think there are folks that might not have that same type of flexibility for their first paid directorship. That being said, it's kind of like a marriage. Like, You don't want to get into that bad directorship, particularly if it's a board where, to Kris's point, you either don't fit or you don't trust them or something like that. That can have long-term consequences for your ability to get nominated to subsequent boards.
That's a very good point. And I do think the question of, it circles back to your first conversation, Travis, about the duties on a board. And I think one point I'd like to highlight from that is that process protects you, right? Because if under the business judgment rule, there's a lot of things that you can make a different judgment than someone else might have made. But if you followed good process, done your due diligence, learned what you need to do, deliberated appropriately, you're protected in that circumstance. So to me, one of the interesting questions here is it a board? Because there are some boards that ignore process, right? And that's something culturally sometimes you can see before you get on, that even if you don't agree with everyone on the board, if they're following good process, you're at least not going to take on legal risks as a result of bad fundamentals in the board structure.
Yeah, absolutely. There are bad boards. I mean, that's the way to put it. There are some boards out there that are bad. Usually it happens more in the private company context because they just haven't had to, they haven't really had investor scrutiny. They haven't had to deal with the quarterly earnings cycles. They haven't had to set up audit, nom-gov, compensation committees and deal with those things, even though they probably should anyways. And they also haven't paid for good advice at that point either, right? It's some advisors that have been appointed either by the CEO or a venture capital or private equity fund, and that's good enough for now, and we can worry about scrutiny later on down the road. Those, particularly if you're an educated director that's interested in governance, you can bring a lot of value to. I mean, you really can. Just think about, the time and effort and energy that'll go into that.
Travis, you mentioned private boards, but if I might just add to that, boards with controlling shareholders can equally be bad. You really have to find out how much will your voice be listened to, even though you've been appointed to this board.
Yes. And some of us are, gluttons for punishment, right? I mean, I love a good challenge. I love seeing a board that I think, oh, I can really help this company improve and this board improve. And so my final piece of advice on this topic would be back to the documents, but beyond the D&O insurance, I would look at the bylaws, right? If you're going into a situation where the company's changing and needing to improve its governance, sometimes that can be hampered by what's really in the docs underneath about how the company should be governed. And I personally have had the experience of not reading them until I was well on the way of a year into the board and discovering some things that are like, oh, this is going to make our improvement journey so much more difficult. So the fine print is really worth paying attention to. And I guess I want to move on to compensation, but I just want to touch for 1 second on your reference to the duty of oversight that is more important now than before, with some of the newer case law and some of the liability there. And what would you recommend to directors to be sure is in place to make sure that the board is fulfilling that duty of oversight?
So it varies depending on the stage and the resources and the size of the company. Obviously, a startup is not going to be able to put in the types of robust risk management that General Electric has. But the key is probably in your interviews to accept the board position, you should ask, what are the mission critical risks of this business? Some of them are obvious. Again, with the ice cream company, it's food safety. With the planes, it's manufacturing and flight safety. But some of them might not be as obvious. And then there are others that are just ubiquitous, like cybersecurity and human resources, human capital, those types of issues. You want to make sure that there is some kind of built-in upward reporting function that goes to the board. It is not enough that management says, don't worry, we've got this, we're going to be good. The case law is crystal clear that the duty of oversight belongs to the board and cannot be delegated. Now, you can have management set up different systems that report to them and report to the board, but there's usually that hotline, something like that, where the employees can call to the board. Are you going to have a hotline in a startup? Probably not. Is that something that you can suggest and have adopted? Yeah, absolutely. And a CEO that kind of puts their foot down in the interview process against that, it's probably a red flag there. It's a regular, so boards should regularly evaluate the systems and think about what improvements, if any, are necessary. Time goes on, businesses change, the law changes. And so you want to make sure that you're not frozen into 1990s, but you're evolving along with the business and legal reality that you live in.
I liken it a little bit to going in for your annual physical, and the doctor runs the blood panel and does the x-ray and does the EKG. And what you hope is there's nothing the matter. But sometimes there's something the matter, and then you can dig in. But if you're not doing the screening, that's where the board can be liable for lack of oversight if they're not paying attention.
Yeah.
So
Ask questions. The best thing you can do as a director is just be willing to confess ignorance to something and say, I don't know. Can you tell me? Help me out here. I want to know. I want to understand.
Yeah. So moving on to compensation, I think, and if you read the Wall Street Journal and you hear about how the top 100 boards and the median compensation is over $300,000 a year, it starts to feel like a get rich quick scheme here. But the reality is that it's like saying, I want to be a director to make money. It's like saying I want to play basketball because I want to earn as much as Steph Curry does. Right. So there's definitely a range of compensation for board work. And there's only a few companies that are in that category of the top 100 public companies in the country. So David, can you talk a little bit about kind of the range of compensation and what are realistic ways to think about what the compensation for this role should be?
Right. So the compensation can vary widely, mostly based on company size, but also based on industry and so on. If you look at NACD data, the range for the smallest public companies to the biggest can go anywhere from around $140,000 total per year, all the way up to north of 300,000, as you mentioned, Kris. So there's a wide range there. And then if you look at private companies, who in general tend to be smaller, but also are subject to less external scrutiny, and frankly, in many cases aren't bringing outside experts in because they don't have that external scrutiny to try to assess what level is competitive, those pay levels could get lower still, and median ranges for those companies may be anywhere from $30,000 to $60,000 annual retainer for some of the smaller organizations. So it's a wide fairway.
And how about the questions of cash compensation versus some kind of equity or long-term incentive? What do you see there?
Well, so director compensation in general is much simpler than executive compensation. You don't see incentive schemes. You don't see a lot of moving parts. And in fact, over the last several years, the trend has been towards fewer moving parts for public companies, at least. Equity and cash retainers are the two most common pieces for public companies. And you will find that on any public company board, certainly, you'll see an expectation that you'll be holding a reasonable amount of equity over time to ensure that alignment with shareholders. So you will probably have a meaningful portion of your compensation provided in equity with that intent in mind, that you'll have that direct alignment with the folks whose interests you're supposed to be looking out for and overseeing management.
And is there a standard as to how much equity a director should hold?
Well, so there are the typical guideline is somewhere around 5 times whatever the annual cash retainer is on the board. So if you look at NACD best practice guidelines, the general rule of thumb is that director pay should be in the form of cash and equity, with at least 50% in the form of equity. And the reason that you provide compensation in the form of equity is so that it's easy to get to those levels of ownership without going out and writing a check. So generally speaking, on a public company board, you may be expected over the first 5 years that you're on the board to build up a level of ownership equal to about 5 times what the annual cash retainer is. And you should be able to get there simply by holding the after-tax proceeds of the shares that you're granted.
And if you, what about equity like awards in private companies?
So it's really a minority practice. The last data that I saw indicated probably about 20% of private companies may have some real equity device. And those are mostly in organizations that are, not really family controlled, maybe more private equity backed, or private going concern private companies that have been around for a long time, have an established equity program, maybe for some of their employees as well.
I do find it interesting. Also, there's some, certainly as we were planning this panel, one of our fellow directors was talking about an expectation of actually purchasing stock above and beyond what you would be awarded or given with board fees. And in private equity deals, often there's an opportunity to invest alongside that's discretionary, but is really a signal of commitment to the company and commitment to the vision for the company. So I think it's worth any of our listeners knowing that there are moments in board service where you might be investing more money than you're taking out at any point in time.
Right. And to one of your prior questions, Kris, I think one of the things I'd want to understand coming in as a director is what that expectation is regarding the amount of ownership that you're expected to maintain. Because I know for some new directors and some conversations I've had, it's been a surprise, or not everybody has the ability to hold a certain amount of equity for a long period of time. So that's something that you'd want to understand coming in as well.
By the way, to that point of holding it, like your ability to actually liquidate a position is something that public companies especially may frown upon at certain times. And so even though you think that you should be able to sell, you might not be able to. Or separately, I know some people have tried to get margin loans against their stock. And in a lot of public companies, that's just flat out, most public companies, that's just flat out prohibited.
Yeah.
If I can just add a point, David, your comments were extremely helpful for the following point. My experience is very often as individuals are beginning to think about transitioning from a full-time executive position to either a single board in addition to their executive president, but more often than that, pivoting completely into a professional board type role, they haven't really thought through everything that David just mentioned. And what I mean by that is there are very serious cash flow implications, right? Stock versus cash, which obviously everyone is different. Everyone has their own financial planning, but you really need to think through the time it might take you to get on a board. So if you leave an executive position, hoping to get on a board, what's the gap? But more important than that is just, does this combination of board positions on an after-tax basis, once you pay the tax on the equity, does it give me the cash flow that I need to sustain a certain lifestyle? So all of this needs to go, in addition to the D&O insurance, for example, that Travis was talking about earlier, all of this has to go into your calculations as to whether board service is right for you at this moment in time.
And to that last point, if you are relying on one board position to maintain your standard of living, there is a big question of whether you are independent of management, because if they decide not to reelect you, then you have lost your potentially sole source of income. If your decision is later challenged by a court and they find that out, particularly if you didn't tell anybody that in the first place, that can come back to bite you. So You do not want to find yourself, unless either you're an employee director or you're okay with not being truly independent of management, being reliant upon that single directorship for your livelihood.
And building on that, I think you can't even say, oh, here's a typical board, a typical healthy board, you can serve 10 years or so, right? So if I get 3 boards and I'm on each one of them for 10 years, right, this is what it looks like, because what happens, right? The company gets sold. The company decides to refresh the board, right? And they're proactive and have different needs over time. If it's a private equity board, they're sold, and you get out and don't have a board seat, or they don't sell and your money's tied up for much longer. So it is an unpredictable portfolio that way. And it's important to keep that in mind. So now that we've talked all about all the the things to create anxiety about board positions, let's talk about how you get one, and move on to because it can be a long process, and there's lots of different ways that board seats get filled. So it's not a linear process either, right? That there's one path to get there. So Steve, do you want to give us some opening comments on the best ways to get a board seat?
I do, and I do want to though add to what you were just mentioning, Kris, a moment ago, which is we're giving you all the reasons what to be careful for, and yet on the other hand, we all live amongst board members who adore what they do, are extraordinarily good at what they do, and will do this for many years to come. So, yes, we put out some red flags, but board service is something that is very valuable to yourself, to the companies, to the community. So we want to encourage people to look at it from a positive point of view, but just beware. So look, on how to get onto a board, obviously the landscape is changing very, very, very quickly. And we've all heard, I suspect, what Governor Abbott said earlier today about state universities and DE&I, and same thing in Florida. Make no mistake, DE&I is a very high agenda item for every one of the boards that we work with. So this is not something that's coming and going. It is there. It is there permanently. And I say that because to give you a sort of a sense that boards that are highly diverse in every sense of the term, we have quantifiable information that says are more effective than boards that are not. And so, boards are actively looking for diversity in lots of different ways. And in many cases, we've seen where boards will actually increase the board size for a period of time in order to get the diversity on a more accelerated basis. Because part of the criticism that you hear from investor groups and so forth is that it takes so long to refresh boards. If you've got a board of 9 white men and you look at a normal cadence of retirement, it could take 9, 10, 12, 15 years before you had some kind of truly diverse. So boards are thinking about how do we accelerate this very much. So back to how do you get on a board? Look, there are lots of ways to do it. First of all, you really need to think about what are you good at doing? And Travis, I want to go on a board until you told me all the things that I have to do as a board member. The fact is, you really need to look into your soul and say, yeah, this is something not only can I do, but I can do very well. Because as you go through the interviewing process, if it's not your sweet spot, or if your references would suggest that you don't come to meetings as well prepared as perhaps you should, or things of that nature, it's not going to work. So you really do need to be very honest with yourself and say, yeah, this is something I, A, have the time to do, B, I have the interest to do, and more importantly, I can add something to the boards I might join. And that might be in terms of an expertise, whether it's cybersecurity or supply chain. It also might be by, if you want to define an industry vertical or a restructuring capability. So you need to sort of inventory your own skill set. The two or three other things I would mention is your best reference, without a doubt, in my view, will be your own company board, whether you're an executive in that company or whether you're the CEO. They will understand. In other words, if I get an inbound call or email from a board member who says, we have the CFO who would both benefit from being a board member and would be really good at being a board member, that's a board member who knows what it takes to be a board member. And therefore, I will take his recommendation very, very highly. and will be active in trying to help this CFO get on a board. So look to your own board for the recommendation. Secondly, your own CEO, and this is very important if you're not a sitting CEO. We want to know from the outset whether this company that you're working for will support you serving on a board at this moment in time. And there's a rule of thumb, which is we never want, and companies never want, a first-year employee to be serving on an outside board. So if you join a board, you join a company and you're the CFO in your first year, you should be heads down, learning your job, doing what you're being paid to do as a full-time basis before thinking about going on to a board. The third piece, super important, is don't think of this as a CV-driven exercise. Think of it more as a board biography exercise. So craft something that is very compelling, that really speaks to not just your executive career, but the kinds of work that you have done that would resonate with board members who are looking for someone to join their board. Kris, I was struck by all the types of board service that you have had, from public to private to nonprofit, and I think you should be very inclusive of board-like experience in this bio. Two examples. One would be many companies have joint ventures. These are internal boards, but function in a fiduciary way, maybe without all the same bells and whistles of what Travis explained, but they behave like a board in many ways. The other would be what I would call meaningful nonprofits, and meaningful defined as hospital systems, universities, the larger nonprofits where they're making very serious decisions each and every day of their existence. That will give people a sense that you know how to operate around a boardroom table. You're collaborative, you come prepared. As Travis said, you come prepared, you've read your materials, that this is the kind of person they can rely on in a good day and a bad day. So let me just stop there and turn it over back to you, Kris.
No, it's very interesting. So I have to do like in the boards I've served on, when I think of my very first board was, I went to the chair of our board when I was an executive and said, for development purposes, I think I need to understand what it's like to sit on the other side of the table. Mm-hmm. And he went to the search firms that were doing the work for our board and said, I have an executive, exactly what you said, right? And that was my very first public board. And I got a board through a networking dinner. I got a board through a long-term thought partner who said, after 6 years of chatting about governance, called and said, I have your board, right? And it had all of the, from a fit perspective, it was my industry, it was my governance structure, it was everything that she knew I was going to be the leading candidate for that seat, no matter what. And I've even gotten a board seat through an ex-employee who was, asked at another company to recommend potential director candidates. So there's a huge variety of things that you can do in order to get a board seat. And I do think patience is super important in this. Can you touch though on the, because obviously what percentage of board seats go through search?
Yeah, that's a question we obviously, Kris, hear frequently. And let me first explain that search firms are more and more involved in searches because it is no longer the country club variety of putting a board together where you would put your 4 or 5 buddies on the board. And literally that happened up until fairly recently. We mentioned at the outset this notion around DE&I, diversity, broadly speaking, enormously important. And very often, these are not individuals who the current board members will be familiar enough with in order to populate on them by themselves. So, others on the phone might opine, but I would say a good 50% of searches today go through a search firm in one form or other. But an important caveat to this is you should not think of search firms versus non-search firms. It's a continuum of information, and we work very closely with our boards who will themselves nominate people that they have met. Kris, just like you described, the board that you went on, I don't know if there's a search firm involved or not, but very often when we start a search, in fact, always when we start a search, we will say to the board, or the board will say to us, oh, here's a little file of people we've collected over the last year or two, include them in the process. And we're always very insistent that the economics of recruiting someone who's been introduced to us by a board member versus someone we may have introduced in the process is exactly the same, so that there is not a bias towards taking a board member introduced by the board versus someone introduced by the search firm. So it's all of the above is really the answer.
Yeah, I think, when I think about my own, even if I was referred by a person that I met and networked with, that reference ended up going into a search firm who
Right.
managed with all of the other candidates. So
Because really, if
you're
you think
absolutely
about it, the name identification, thanks to LinkedIn and many other databases, including NACD, by the way, is really the easy part of the job. The more important part is qualifications, it's fit, it's all of the other stuff that goes around putting a board together versus just finding a name and finding a person.
And to that specific point, advocacy, like having people that are going to advocate for you in that decision-making process is important. If you don't know anybody at the company, if you don't know anybody at the search firm, even if they find you on LinkedIn, they're probably not going to get it, right? Unless you're just a perfect fit. And I think that goes back to Steve's point about networking and being involved and knowing these companies where you might get selected.
And I'm going to move on to Q&A, but I would love for you guys just to provide some tips on effective networking while I look at the questions that have come in, because I do think there's good ways and there's healthier ways and less healthy ways to network. And I'm sure the audience would appreciate your insights there.
Well, Travis, you want to start?
Sure. I think the best way to network is to offer something for nothing, frankly. I mean, I think what you do is you meet people, you see what they're interested in, and you try to give them value without an expectation of something in return. And that's how you build a real network where people know you and can rely on you. And then if they do happen to find a use for you in the future, they know that you're somebody that, isn't just there having casual drinks with strangers all the time. You're actually a real person, and you actually can help them in what they're doing. And then your reputation, I think, is the second part. You have got to maintain a reputation of professionalism, of somebody who's qualified and eligible to be a director. I think that participating in NACD, getting certified, those types of things are very important to maintain that as part of your networking efforts.
David?
I really echo what Travis had to say. In my experience, being able to deliver real value to people and reputation through doing great work, those are the ways that I've found are the most effective ways to network.
Yeah.
But I do think that broadly speaking, it varies from one person to the next what's going to be the most effective way. Delivering value is key.
And I'll just do a slight variation on that, but basically the same theme, which is know what you're good at and what you're not. For you to be raising your hand every time you get a phone call, thinking you're the right person. I'm coming back to what David and Travis just said, is we much more appreciate when you say, look, that one is not for me. Oh, here is someone who I think would be very, very good at it. But since I've got you on the phone, let me just spend a few minutes telling you what I really am interested in. So you've given them something for free, as David and Travis said, but you've also had 5 minutes of the ear to say, look, I really am interested in joining a board. These are the things that I would be most qualified for, never mind the most interested for. And that resonates very well with search professionals. What it is not is going to a Jen Cox NACD event and handing out business cards. That is not good networking.
I really appreciate all of your
Just one quick thing I will say. One good thing about the NACD events is there are actually directors there.
Yeah,
Directors or GCs or CEOs and the like, people that can, if you don't have that network currently, you got to get it, because if they don't know who you are, they're never going to pick you.
That is true. So true.
Well, and I think that those are really good points, because NACD is a great forum for for meeting people, but when you meet them, you need to provide value, because I think, you know, the way you network is a reflection of how you'll be as a director, right? Do you come into a group and try to add value, right? And people will take the data from how you approach them from a networking perspective and extrapolate from that whether they would want to serve with you. So it's always good to keep that in mind. So with that, I want to go into the questions that we've gotten, and but I just want to reiterate Steve's point about, even though we're talking about cautions and difficulty and challenge, this really is wonderful work to do. And it's so meaningful because it's so important to every organization to be well governed, right? That's critical. And to the extent we all contribute to that, we're doing a great service to the world to have better governed businesses out there. So I'm gonna start with some comp questions that came in to get to David. There's a question about private equity board compensation and how that and what's typical from a private equity perspective, and also to comment on whether it makes sense to take your meeting fees as stock if that option is available.
So thank you, Kris. I'll take the first question on private equity. It's difficult to identify private equity trends because private equity deals can vary so much from one firm to the next, and the exit strategy for the particular situation. Generally speaking, I think you have more opportunities there to buy in than you might elsewhere. But I'm not aware of any big overarching trends in private equity director compensation to identify. As far as taking compensation in the form of stock versus cash, there are a lot of companies that offer this, offer the opportunity to defer a portion of your pay or take a portion of your pay in stock, usually in part as a way to facilitate building ownership, as we talked about before, which is important on a lot of public company boards. But in some cases also to allow directors an opportunity to better plan or time taxable events. So you'll be able to take your equity in the form of units that you can defer to a future date. And there are a lot of directors that choose to take that route, in part because it satisfies both of those considerations. One, you're building ownership and you kind of set it over here and you don't have to think about it. And you're also sort of, as part of your financial planning, timing when you're going to actually have to recognize that income.
Yeah.
One thing just to hit on the private equity point is that not all equity is created equal. And I'm not talking about options versus profit interest versus those types of things, but specifically, if you're in an LLC structure or something like that, where there's a waterfall, and I don't want to get into all the financial engineering, but there are very real possibilities that the company gets sold for a high multiple and you never see a dollar because the preference stack takes all of that money. There are two things about that. One, if you're the residual equity, you might never get paid. Two, if you're not the residual equity and you have the preference, you may have a conflict from the other equity holders, the stockholders that you're supposed to be representing. And so you need to think about that before you accept that equity award. A similar thing happens in SPACs, which was all of these directors got paid in units or shares or things like that of the SPAC. But as a result, Delaware has decided that a lot of them had insurmountable conflicts.
I think that's a really, really good point, Travis, because it's when you see the reported private equity results and the multiples that things trade at, they start usually with recognizing their own fees as return to their investors, right? So that is part of their multiple of what they put in the first place, but those fees come out off the top, right, before anything goes to other shares. So really understanding the structure is important. Here's an interesting question about this concept of fit for the board, and touches on, Steve, your comments on diversity. and equity and inclusion. So if you're being brought in as a board candidate, as a diverse candidate, and that's what the board sees as your fit, how do you think about fit for yourself in that circumstance? And
Yeah,
whether
yeah,
it can be good when you're brought in?
yeah, that's a great question. And I'm not sure there's a perfect answer, and I'm not sure I'm the perfect one to give the answer. However, I will say this. You need to make sure that the commitment of the company, the executives in the company, is on a parallel track with that of the board. If you see this happening at the board level, but you're not seeing an equal commitment to diversity in the company, I would question whether I'm being brought on, I hate to use the term tokenism, but more in that vein than a serious corporate commitment to do the right thing with respect to diversity, inclusion, and belonging. So that's where I would really look and ask the hard questions. If you are a single or double diversity candidate, the reality is you're going to have several options ahead of you, just given the pressures to diversify boards. And I think you need to ask the hard questions, but in a very, I don't want to say the word collegial, but in a way that shows that you're trying to solve the problem, that you're not trying to double down on the problem, right? So ask the questions up front, because once you're in, this is the thing that we haven't really talked about, but there's a moral obligation, unless there's a financial reason, to stay with a board for a longer period of time than you might have in an executive role. So joining a board and leaving a year later because you don't like what you see is really not an acceptable option.
And I'll just say there's a big difference between public and private companies in this. Any public company that has, as Steve said, 9 white men at this point, the chair of their nom-gov last year got voted against or had a recommendation of withhold. And the institutional investors, they inflamed about that type of a situation. And so if somebody's coming to you right now to be the very first diverse candidate, there are 2 things going on. One, that's probably why, not because they have a belief in diversity, but because they've been fighting for years and now they don't have a choice. But 2, you really have an opportunity to be an instrument for change in that company, and they probably need it, and the investors and the stockholders probably need that as well. If that's one of the governance issues they probably have others. And you can be a force for good on that board. They are required to include you in all full board meetings. You don't have to feel like an outsider. It's the obligation of the company to, keep you involved and keep you informed.
But it's interesting, Travis, because first of all, I agree with you, but there's so much unconscious bias that takes place on boards. I mean, just think of, how do they get together? Where do they get together? What sporting activities do they do that might or might not be inclusive of all the board members? And so you need to really feel that this board is committed to change. And Kris, would love to hear your view, obviously, committed to the changes that they are talking about, and not just talking about them, but living them.
I've been very lucky in my career that on all of my public boards, I've been the 3rd woman. And often people talk about the fact that when there are 3, you're no longer a representative of your status, right? But you can be yourself, right? There's enough women in the room. And I've, had the pleasure at Key of doing CEO selection, where we selected the first woman CEO in the banking industry, when we had, I believe, 6 of 14 board members were women. So there was no question in the room. To your point about unconscious bias, there was no way people could come into the room and just side question say, do you think she can handle it? That question was off the table.
Yeah.
So the environment does matter. And I think I would think more, it's definitely more challenging when you're the first. And it's also more challenging when you don't see a mirrored behavior within management. So I would double click on that perspective, that you want to see it at both sides to see a true commitment. So.
We recently did a search for a company where the nominating committee, where they were very seriously, with tremendous sincerity, looking for diversity. the nominating committee was 3 white men. And we had to say to the nominating committee, that may be how you've created this committee. That committee is not going to work effectively when you parade all these people in to meet with you, and they look at the 3 of you and say, do you really believe what you're saying? So what we did is we shifted things around to make sure that we had something other than the nominating committee part of the process, so that they, that because there were other diverse members on the board, just happened not to be on the nominating committee. So you got to look at all those subtle clues along the way to make sure that you are joining the group you want to be joining.